I think someone had a question.
Yes. It was in regards to the publicity surrounding these goals. I know that there is a significant amount, especially in regards to certain ones which may be of a crucial element in a country. If, for example, poverty is a big problem in a country, it makes sense that it will receive more publicity there, and there is incentive to focus on that. Would it be correct to assume that this publicity will have an influence on which goals a government will pick and how effective they are in implementing these?
That's a good question. I want to pick up on your point around publicity first. Sometimes there isn't publicity around poverty. I used to live in Hong Kong, bustling city. At the time it had 7 million population. I don't know how many are now. And I remember walking around and noticing that there weren't any street people. So I assumed there weren't any poor people in Hong Kong. Lots of glitzy apartment buildings, lots of restaurants, lots of people seemed to have money. There was tons of shopping going on. And then one day I learned two things. One, that a lot of homeless people lived at the top of these skyscrapers, or not the skyscrapers, the buildings, the business buildings, but residential buildings, sometimes went as high as 30 or 35 stories. And then you could get to the top and people would camp out there. What that meant was they were invisible, right? We didn't see them on the streets. Secondly, some people would get together and rent teeny tiny apartments. Like, I mean, maybe half the size of this room, and would install cages. The reason it was a cage was so that people, and there was maybe three stories, so then people could go in there and have their own space. They could lock so that they wouldn't, if there were any security issues with other people in the room. And so they would share this apartment, and you might have 3, 6, 9, 12 people, perhaps, in a room this size. Again, that made them invisible. And it wasn't until there was some publicity around that people started paying attention. So I think the role of publicity is important because it does shine light on, again, where are the people and what's happening with them. But it doesn't necessarily translate into decisions. That requires people, again, to be advocating for them. It requires decision makers to think about creative policies about how you can generate the money to deliver better services. So I think it goes hand in hand. I think the publicity is really important because if it's not there, you don't see them. But I think it's more than publicity. It takes action to generate solutions. I'm not sure if that answered your question. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
So, like, one of the personal issues I have with SDGs when I look at it is that I think it looks too much on the future rather than the past. Because, like, the first goal, let's say, targets no poverty. And I think if we trace back to why there's so many countries that have such a high rate of poverty, it can be traced back to obviously a lot of things. But I think the most relevant is, let's say, capitalism. And I don't think capitalism is going away anytime soon. So do you think it would make more sense to kind of take a step back and reverse the causes of poverty, or just kind of look into the future and just add more, I guess, goals and like more projects and initiatives to help poverty, if that makes sense?
It does make sense, and that's why I started out by focusing on why. I think you're right. It's so important to understand how did we get here and not just look at, oh, this is what we want to do. There actually probably shouldn't be 700 million people living in extreme poverty. It's not about the money, right? It's not about the money. We saw with the COVID-19 pandemic how quickly money could be accessed and generated, right? How quickly we were able to convene decision makers and make decisions around PPE and lockdowns and access to vaccines and putting money into vaccine research that was happening already, but how can we accelerate it because we need it now? It wasn't about the money, right? So you're right, it's about power structures and imbalances. It's about how decisions were made 15, 20, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So I think it's very important to understand the historical context, to understand why things are the way they are, because then you can come up with a more practical solution for going forward. That's why I think historians are really important, right? Not just the policy and political side. Thanks. Yes?
I wanted to look back to the point on publicity a bit. It's uh, and I wanted to address the inverse practically. For example, would it be possible that the reason why they're set so high usually is because uh, it will show to a certain extent, look how much effort we're doing towards this point, and uh, it shows to a more significant extent that they're going to try at least.
So I think if I'm understanding correctly, why are we collecting all this data on how we're doing? And is it just to show, hey, that we're making progress, but understanding the evidence behind it? Is that what you mean?
Kind of. What I'm more referring to is at the start you mentioned how you mentioned how it the different SDG goals were generally high, states were not attaining them regularly. So, why are they setting them so high? From my point of view, there is a certain element of publicity in there, and an element of if they lower it to a reasonable amount, it's going to look bad to the keys to their power.
Right. Might not seem very ambitious if you have, let's just, I get that. And I think that's why, and again, I go back to that conversation with my son. It was around, yes, have those aspirational goals, leave no one behind, end poverty, but be realistic about what's doable and take it in chunks. And so that perhaps to make the SDGs in this current framework a little more relevant and concrete now is to keep some of those principles, leave no one behind, end poverty, but to have the targets be more closely time-bound, right? We can't end poverty in the next 7 years. We could, but a lot of things would have to happen. So why don't we say we want to reduce poverty in Canada by 50% by 2030, or by 20%, make it more manageable. But don't just look at 2030 as an end point. Keep going. Don't set up a whole new negotiated process. I don't think that if we were trying to negotiate this today, I don't think this would be possible. I don't think that we would be able to get this kind of specificity, which does come out in the 169 targets, and I encourage you to look them up. There's very concrete things there. I don't think we could get that level of agreement on that level of specificity today. There's a lot of polarization, there's a lot of turmoil, there's a lot of fear, but there's also a lot of innovation and great, exciting things happening. And so I think, to your point, keeping some of those aspirational things in mind, this is what we're heading to. That needs to be a motivator, but we need to be concrete and take step by step and have realistic targets and timeframes so that we don't just get cynicism of, oh, well, we can't achieve that anyway, so why bother? Thank you. I think you had your hand up.
Thank you for your presentation. It was so interesting. I have two questions. I understand these SDGs and what was before the MDGs, right? We're very much a creature of its time, right? Of the time of American unipolarity and a very, very strong prevalence of Western Northern views over the rest of the world. A time that you seem to imply, and I would agree, it's a time that is finished. And so for us, that we have for the past 25 years been in this very privileged position. Now we have to say bye-bye to it, right? So I have two questions about this. One of them is more procedural. You mentioned consensus, that how it was reached about the different goals and about the targets. Could you tell us, as much as you know, more about what was the process of this consensus building? Was there actual voting? Mm-hmm. If the voting was done on specific goals, one goal by goal, or target by target, or was it done as a package? And were there any alternatives that you remember that got voted down? And that is one, the procedural part. And the second one is about your reflection about, we have to include more southern perspectives. We can have a discussion about the rationale for that, but if we were to do that, what of our northern perspectives would you be ready to give up? Thank you.
I don't know if I could answer all of those questions. That's great. Yeah, on the procedural stuff, from what I remember, and half of my gray hair was from that point in time. I was at the Canadian International Development Agency, part of a policy unit that was working with our colleagues in New York to figure out what was this beast going to be and how were we going to do it. And I can tell you that it was really confusing sometimes because it got so technical very quickly, right? And that the starting point was bringing together stakeholders and experts, people who knew about water and sanitation, people who knew about climate smart agriculture, people who knew about health systems. And here we were in Ottawa, a policy shop. But what it forced us to do internally was to connect to policy specialists around our own department and outside of it. So there was a lot of consultation and discussion with civil society partners, and a lot of back and forth. So, New York would send, okay, this is what they're talking about now around health or gender or environment or whatever, and we would farm it out to different experts and discuss and see. But yes, that was achieved by consensus. So there were multiple drafts of the whole framework that went back and forth and back and forth. And I don't know if any of you have seen, or some of you who have done research on international, multinational negotiations, sometimes you're there for hours and hours and hours negotiating on whether there's a comma or an and. What does it mean? Like I said earlier, words like healthcare services, at first you're like, yeah, great. Who can say no to healthcare services? Except when you get asked by a particular country, well, does that include abortion? Well, then you open up a whole other negotiation and you might be there for several more hours or days. Yeah. In terms of the second part of your question, sort of, if I understood correctly, like what would I not agree to or not?
Laid out a very comprehensive, very northern view of what global development should be. And when you get southern voices that have majority support in the South, in the global South, then they're not going to agree, right? You are aware of that.
I don't know. They're not going to agree to have access to resources, income generating or healthcare resources or education resources. Yeah, there are some countries, but I think they're few and far between.
If you look at the global map, for example, on rights for the LGBTQ community, that would very clearly draw.
Absolutely.
A line, right, between
Yeah.
the global north and the global south.
Yeah.
Some exceptions.
Yeah.
In both ways.
Yes,
That
and
is one example.
yeah. And there are two networks, for example, in Africa, homegrown local networks across Africa that are working quite quietly now and underground, especially following the news in Uganda and Kenya, which was further criminalizing. But there are local networks of people that are addressing and advocating for and pushing on these issues. So I think that while there might be some people and some governments and some places of power that don't agree, I think that there are people who do want to have those kind of rights issues addressed. And it's not just people that look like me going there to say so, but there are local activists, local researchers advocating for these things.
Sorry, just one short counterpoint.
Sure.
Talking about public opinion, like there are very comprehensive studies on global public opinion on these issues that I just mentioned, and also, for example, on feminism, right? So it's not a question of people in government, it's about the majority of public opinion. I mean, I am also from the South, and I may not agree with some of the minority opinions in the region of the world where I'm coming from, but I know what the consensus or the minority opinion is, right? So, I mean, we should be under no, how can I say, we should not deceive ourselves, right? We can certainly, and I worked in international development, I know the power of money to try to proselytize in the South, to get people in the South to work for our views on the North, right? But I'm talking about the majority public opinion.
Yeah. I think that's where other voices come in and why it's important to pay attention to them. So let's listen to what the novelists are saying, the poets, the journalists, the activists, and how are they, what's the role that they have in shifting public opinion or giving voice to parts of public opinion that don't feel safe to share their views as well. Thank you. Yep.
Just to kind of think off that, I feel like when we're looking at the outline of these SDGs, they're all to achieve a goal. And I feel like when we're looking at these goals, it's to have an ideal like global society. And how do I say this? That's not like the idea of what our global society should look like. Do you feel like it is more ideal to one part of the world compared to another, specifically with these like goals and expectations in order to achieve these SDGs?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean. So
like for instance, if you look at the country, like I'm half Eritrean, right? So Eritrea specifically does not believe in a lot of the ways that most of the world, specifically in Canada or the West, chooses to operate, sustain money, income, and etc. But if they were to entertain or work towards supporting the SDGs, which would make them look like a great country in terms of international development, that would be positive because they would get support. But because they don't do that, a lot of the times they're reframed or disregarded, and that actually creates bigger gaps globally and domestically, which creates more migration, which creates more international crisis because they don't agree with the SDGs, they don't agree with how we see a perfect society. So how can we say that these SDGs are something we should be achieving if it's not actually something that's ideal or perfect for everyone?
I think that's a really good comment. I think that's where that quote unquote common but differentiated responsibilities comes in. Recognition that it's not a cookie cutter thing. It's not what works in Canada is not going to work necessarily in Eritrea or Colombia or anywhere else. And that's why I go back to the idea and the necessity of listening to local voices and researchers and academics and writers and journalists, not just government people or people in power, but trying to identify other voices and bringing those out and other ideas so that it's not transplanting ideas, nor is it just a small elite, people in power who are trying to hold on to it, creating the decisions. The framework was re-agreed to in September. All countries agreed to continue with this. Why? I think one, because it's there, it's the UN, we kind of like to agree, and so let's build consensus where we have it, given that there's so much that's not going on. Two, I think a lot of developing countries, if I could put it that way, the G77, the group of 77, which is way more than 77 countries, but representing, 4/5 of the world, wants to keep our feet to the fire and not lose sight of the resources that are necessary, but not just official development assistance, right? How do we get, again, the private sector involved? and wanting to keep access to those resources. But I think to me, it's about also trying to, really pushing on homegrown solutions, working with local perspectives and local communities. And if it's in places where those people don't have voice, right, don't have access to social space where they can share those, that's where other countries regionally or outside can maybe help to advocate for that, to push for that. One example, this is many, many years ago, I had the opportunity to hear a speech by a minister from the cabinet in Chile. And he talked about the support that Canada gave through IDRC, actually, back in the 70s, during a time under a dictatorship in Chile, where there was opportunity to bring together very quietly, underground kind of thing, activists, academics, journalists, people working on the margins to talk about issues around governance, to talk about issues related to human rights. Fast forward, he was then speaking as a member of the cabinet in Chile under a democracy, and he said many of the people around that cabinet table had been part of those conversations funded by Canada. And that's not a lot of funding, but it's about creating a space, opening up a place. And I don't know the mechanics of how they did it or what we did, but it wasn't a lot of money, but it was convening, bringing people together to share ideas that could then allow them within their own reality to make change in their system. I don't know, to me that was really powerful. It wasn't about us transplanting ideas. These were things they wanted, that they were working on, they knew were important, but they didn't have ways to collectively bring that forward. And so this allowed that to happen. I don't know how much time we have. I'm happy to keep going.
I think we have about another 15 minutes.
Okay, fine.
Might not be really difficult.
Sure.
Okay. All right, 2005, go way back to the depths of time. The last time Canada thought about what is our foreign policy. And I don't think we ever came up with an answer, but the big push that everybody was talking about out of then that other department that CETA didn't like was values and ethics. How do we make the world be like Canada, adopt values and ethics? I look at integration stuff in Latin America, and the EU is point blank crystal clear. We want you to be like us. If you look at Qatari foreign policy, the whole point of Qatari foreign policy is to make Islam like Qatar, not like Saudi, and Saudi in the inverse. And we can go on and on with different things like this. So here's my question for you. This is not a nice one. It's going to get me in trouble. But can we actually achieve global human development without rich countries? And I don't necessarily mean us, but countries with the resources. Can we do this without those countries being imperialist?
Yeah, that was my question. Thanks.
So 2005, maybe a couple of years before, I'm thinking of a country like Indonesia, which was on the verge of state failure. It was considered an almost failed state, right? It was broken, human rights violations, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward to now, it's a G20 member. Its two former presidents, you've got me on the timeline, was part of the high-level panel that was advising the Secretary General on the Sustainable Development Goals framework. It just held what's probably the largest and most complicated democratic election a couple of weeks ago, last week, 2 weeks ago, very recently. I think that, I don't know what the implications of that are in particular, but to me, that's one example.
If we say we're going to talk about sustainable development goals, and these are the things that matter, then is that itself not automatically imperialist because we've forced it to happen?
But that was the point of how the Sustainable Development Goals grew. It wasn't Canadians and Brits and Americans coming to say what should be done. It was two Colombian women who started a conversation and convened discussions with experts and civil society actors from around the world. Right? So that was the very premise and the very purpose of this process, was to turn that around so that it wasn't just a couple of white people in North American and European capitals saying what should be done.
Well, significantly, we have to get the SDGs internally too.
Yeah.
It's not just the North has to do it too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was also the other point, right? That turned it around on its head. It was not just us telling them what to do. It was all of us agreeing that these are things we should all be addressing and working on. I saw hands. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Just on the note of like publicity and action to sustainable goals. If you could speak on your global affairs experience with all the conversations that have been had, and how we can get out of having conversations, funded conversations, public conversations, private conversations, and then more into action, boots on the ground, and so we're like stepping out of the phase of regression and stagnation and more into hitting our targets. How could we locally support our governments, or like hold our feet to the fire to actually continue that?
I think that's. I think there's a number of ways, but I'd love to hear what you think too. You know, what ways do you see as being possible? There is a recognition, and actually the Government of Canada is now putting money into working with civil society organizations to fund public engagement opportunities. An organization like Aga Khan Foundation of Canada, for example, hosts a lot of events that are free to the public that allow for anybody who wants to participate and have these kind of discussions. So that's one. Organization like Cooperation Canada, which is an umbrella group of Canadian civil society organizations working on international development issues. There's way over 80 members, I believe. There's also regional councils that fall under the Cooperation Canada umbrella that, again, bring together organizations in different regions of Canada that work on and are interested in international or domestic engagement on all of the issues that we've talked about today. So there is that recognition that there should be public dialogue and opportunities and spaces to talk about these things and to engage both government and civil society. So there are events or meetings that are held on an annual basis where Government of Canada, either Global Affairs or other line departments, will have consultations or discussions with civil society actors. Another thing, and I just posted this yesterday, or reposted it yesterday, so if you want to look on my LinkedIn, the government department in Canada that's responsible for domestic implementation of the SDGs is ESDC, so Employment Social Development Canada. And there's an SDG unit within that department that coordinates across Government of Canada. And they've launched a consultation, not a consultation, they've launched a public engagement process where anybody can provide input on what they think should be done to move forward on the targets, but also on what people are doing. So you could, you know, if you're writing a paper on an issue that you think will be influential and you want to share it with an organization, you could indicate that you're doing that. If you're working with an organization, an activist organization or a civil society organization, or any of those groups could indicate, you know, what they're doing. But so there is a recognition of needing to identify opportunities for people to come and speak and discuss these issues and share their knowledge rather than just waiting for government to say, here you go, this is what should be done. That's just on the Canadian side. I don't, you know, there's other, there's lots of events. I mean, the UN's always convening events. Again, regular citizens don't necessarily have access to those. One other organization I'll just highlight again because some of you students might be interested. There's an organization here called Young Diplomats of Canada, and they organize, you can apply to participate as youth delegates to some of these large international meetings, either at the UN or the G20 summit process or others. So I'd encourage you to look at that as well, Young Diplomats of Canada.
Yep.
So I'm one of the colleagues of the Begins and a development practitioner from Afghanistan. From case of our country shows that sustainable development goals will only help if the liberal hegemony and the structure of liberal hegemony is supporting that part of the world. All our national policies were aligned with all international programs, including SDG. We even have National Action Plan for Peace and Security, Women, Peace and Security. Probably one of the rare countries in the world. We have National Action Plan for CEDAW. There was nothing that we did not have a National Action Plan to be implemented, including SDG. But with the night of withdrawal from Afghanistan, we are on the verge of humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
One thing I've learned in the past 6 months, with the increase of conflict, with the increase of imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East, we are reproducing poverty. And SDG will not work if we continue to reproduce poverty. That's all.
Yeah.
That, I always, I shared it with Sean. I said I studied development with the hope to be an engaged person, but no one turned as an anti-colonial person like me with studying development. And especially for the past 6 months, I'm a very different person. I'm a very different person. My total view on development, on everything changed. I think until the day that we do not change the structure of the Security Council, the poverty cycle will continue, and these kind of things may help, but not sustainably.
Yeah. Well, I would say, yes, Sandra, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, what I would say is that's the challenge to you all. In the next 5 years, within the next 5 years, you will be engaging in, and maybe many of you already are, in the workforce, either in organizations or politically or as volunteers. And that's the challenge before you. Probably 5 years from now, the international community will start talking about, oh gosh, what do we do next? Because it'll be 2028, 2029, a year or two before 2030. What does success look like then, and what is possible given the context that we're in now? They were created at a time that was already difficult, but it was kind of like all the stars aligned. And so I think that is my perception, my personal view is, let's not just try and negotiate a whole brand new thing, because it's not going to happen. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. What are the nuggets there that can be done? What is achievable? What is within the realm of possibility? Sandra?
Thank you so much for a great talk, really compelling, great discussion. And you handled the difficult questions, I think, really well. It's not possible to please everybody on such an issue, My question comes from, we had COVID, that scuppered things considerably. And then, the UN's not looking fabulous these days in terms of UNRWA and other things, right? Particularly with the issues coming out of the Middle East with Israel, Palestine. It's kind of losing a lot of credibility. So what would you say about that? I realize my question's kind of opening it up a lot, but do you think these SDGs could be a chance for the UN to kind of redeem itself, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't want to go into the whole realm of UN reform and all of that, role of Security Council. A, those aren't my areas of expertise. B, that would take many other days of conversation. I guess I go back to, and again, this is just my personal view, I go back to sitting in a hall like the UN General Assembly versus riding in a minibus in Kenya and looking out the window. Those two images I had up earlier. And I asked myself, what alternative do we have? It can either be each country, each government, each person for themselves, or can there be a place where we can convene and not solve all the world's problems, because that's not going to be possible. But what is possible? Where can we find some element of agreement on what makes sense to help people. And I realize maybe that sounds idealistic, but I don't know if you could be in this business and not be a little bit idealistic, even Sean.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, I think we should probably wrap up there. Thank you so much. Let's thank her for an
Thank
excellent
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and I wish you all well. You are going to be the change makers and achievers that we need. So go forth and come up with great ideas and do them. Your voice matters.
Thank you. And
Thanks.
thank you for being such an excellent contributor to our students.
Oh.
Who've been here too. It's been
My
fantastic.
pleasure.
Okay.